Hi guys, in today's video I'm going to be painting this koi fish. These are the colors that I'm using for today's painting. It's Paul Ruben brand, and these are the brushes. You'll notice the ink wash brush on the top, number 7 round, and some detail brushes. So the first step here is just to draw your sketch. I'm going fast in the video because the drawing is very light, so it's pretty hard to see anyway. You just want to get in those main shapes. You don't need to worry too much about the detail. Now that I have my loose sketch in, I'm going in a little bit more aggressively with pencil, but I'm still pressing very light. I don't want any hard pencil lines. I don't want to wreck the page by putting any creases in it. So I'm still keeping this nice and light as I'm drawing in a little bit more of a refined shape here. Again, nothing too complicated, just the main shapes, the eyes, couple fins. I'm not bothering with any of the patterns on the fish. I'm going to let the watercolor paint help me determine that. But I do want to place the fins. I want kind of all of that stuff feeling good before I start painting. I like to call this my map. Use a kneadable eraser to kind of pull that paint, or sorry, the pencil off before you start painting. So the first painting step that we're going to be doing here is to establish our shadows, and we're going to do that using wet on wet painting. So I'm using my large ink brush here to apply water. One of the nice things about a brush like this is it holds a lot of water, so you can do quite a bit with just a single dip of water or dip of paint. So I've pretty much applied water to the entire fish, and now I'm going to be dropping in some Payne's gray with a little bit of blue in there to the areas that have shadow, and you can just see the paint take off into the water here. I'm not going too dark yet. I'm just kind of setting a nice light base shadow, and then after this dries just a little bit, I'll go in a little bit darker and do a slightly more detailed shadow layer. So you can see I can kind of pick up with this brush as well. If I clean it off, it absorbs some paint, so I can pull a little bit of paint off if I need to there. Just kind of dabbing in that shadow, but letting the water do a lot of work for me. Now the background of this is going to be black, or at least very close to black. So we don't really need to be too careful about the outside edges being clean because it's all going to be hidden anyway. And the fins are going to be in a little bit of a deeper shadow than normal. So I am going to be doing some dark shadows here as I go. Just mixing in some blue, just to give it a little pop of color here. It was feeling very gray. There we go. Again, you can see I'm just being really loose with my shadows. Now I'm getting to the point where I can start to add a little bit of deeper color in here. I'm starting to use the tip of the brush instead of the belly to add a little tiny bit of pattern, just a little hint of pattern. As it catches the water, it's going to blend, but you might still retain a little tiny bit of that pattern, and that would be kind of nice. Again, just being nice and loose. Leaving the highlight on the top, making the shadow is mostly on the left-hand side, a little bit on the right though as well, so the highlight is going to be at the top, and then a teeny bit of shadow around the outside on the back, but most of the shadow is on the left. And then this here is the fin, this is the top fin, so that is a little bit in shadow as well. Now we can kind of get into that back fin with a little bit more aggressive shadow. So I would say that this is considered damp now. The page is starting to dry. When you're doing watercolor, if you have a really wet page, the paint is just going to take off into the water. But if you have a damp page, it'll hold its form a little bit, but it'll give you a beautiful soft edge. So that's kind of what we're going for here, is just a nice soft edge, while still holding just a little bit of that detail that we're adding. So really scooping up the paint now with that brush. Holds a lot of paint. Great brush for this kind of thing. So now I'm going to jump in and do the same thing on the small fish. I'm just adding water. There's a little bit of that gray in the water here, and that's okay because the bottom fish is actually in slightly a darker area. So even the highlights on the bottom fish are going to be a little bit more grayed out. And again, using the tip, because this is a smaller fish, so I do need a little bit more control here. I'm just kind of dropping in my color, letting the water kind of pull it, do its thing. We just want to get a little bit of that shadow in there. Because you guys have already seen this, I think I'll speed up just a little bit here. This step is very similar to what we did on the top. So just look at your reference, whatever fish you're drawing, and then place your shadows accordingly. It's very important to let that dry before we drop in our color. So we're going to be doing wet on wet for the color as well. We're going to add some water where we want our orange dots to be. And then when that, as it's still wet, we're going to drop in our different colors. I'm going to be using red along the edges, and then I'm going to drop in some really, really bright orange in the center to create that highlight that we're looking for. So here's that nice deep red color. You can see it's got a little bit of coolness to it even. And so that's going to be kind of our shadow color for here. We still have the base shadow that should show through a little tiny bit that we established on the white layer, but this will be nice and dark here. You can see the paint is just running with the water. Now, one thing I've noticed about the Paul Ruben paints is that they have very beautiful pigmented color, and they go on the page really nicely, but they don't run with water like some of the other brands do. The Windsor Newton is the Payne's gray, and it really takes off in water, whereas these you need to kind of push them around a little bit more. But you should be able to just let your paint go into the water and do its thing. So here's that beautiful bright orange I was talking about. It's very, very bright, almost leaning fluorescent. This is a color I haven't seen in any other brand but the Paul Ruben brand. So dabbing in orange, dabbing in red, you can see I kind of have to pull the orange and the red together because the paints aren't moving as much as I would expect them to. Any other brand I would expect to move just a little bit more than this, but you can just manipulate the paint with your paintbrush and it's totally fine. So adding that little spot in the front of the face there. This is my favorite step of the whole painting. I really enjoy watching these colors come together. And the reason that we add that entire shadow in the beginning is because we are going to leave some of this fish white. So you want there to be kind of a consistent shadow throughout. If we were to just add in the shadow after the fact, it could be dark in one space, light in another space. When we add it up front, we get a base shadow for everything that's going to follow, but we also get that consistent shadow throughout the white part of the fish. So it works out really well. And now you can see just adding it into the back as well. Same way I wet everything down and then let the paint kind of take to the water. This one, the paint is moving a lot better on the back side actually, which is kind of nice to see. So maybe I just didn't have enough water in the beginning. So building up the red on the outsides and letting that orange sit on the top as a little bit of a highlight. That's going to give us that three-dimensional feel when we look at the fish. And you'll see it matches the shadows that we added in, right? So we did that with the shadows as well. Here, just adding a little bit to the back as well. Now this back area is mostly in shadow. We have the fin, which will give us a little bit of a cast shadow, plus there's a bend there, and we're really not seeing the highlight side. So the highlight is taken over by the fin there, so we're just nice and deep red. Now we're doing the little one. Same thing here with the little fish. This one has a lot more of the orange color on it in my reference, so it's gonna be a little bit more orange. But I still wanna leave some white because I actually think that the white and the orange kind of separation is what makes these koi fish so interesting to paint. So I don't want to go in and just go straight orange with it. That would take out some of the fun for me. I like it to have those spots. So again, doing red along the outside edges, and then I'm going to tap in a little bit of that orange, but not quite as much as the top fish because this fish is a little bit deeper, so it's going to be just a little bit darker. So I'll be doing a little more red with this one. So there goes that orange. The paint is still wet. I'm just adding a little bit more to my top one now. The beautiful orange, it's so bright. Just tapping it in, trying to get a natural kind of blend. I don't want to create a gradient here. I really like the spottiness of it. I think it feels like the fish more if it's a little spotty. So I'm trying to keep it separated to a point, but just blending it enough so that it feels natural. Dropping in that front little part of the face there. Koi fish are really beautiful fish. The bottom one, the eyes are mostly white against the orange skin, so I'm trying to leave that nice and white. And I'm adding a little bit of an extra shadow in here, so I'm just pulling in a little bit of Payne's gray around the outside edge to create a nice deep shadow on the right-hand side there, a little bit on the left as well. And remember, our background is going to be black. So Don't be shy with your shadows. Usually what I end up doing is adding in my dark background, and then my subject matter feels way too bright. And I do this with drawing too. Once you add in your deeps, your deep colors, your deep darks, all of a sudden all of your midtones feel too bright and you have to go in and kind of darken everything up. So that's pretty common. So go ahead and be aggressive with this one. Just go dark with your shadows. If you think it's too dark, don't give up. It's probably fine. Just keep going. Put in that background early if you have to, just for contrast. So now we're going to add some detail. So that's going to be the fins have some detail, the eyes have some detail, the mouth on the top fish is going to be some detail. So we're using a nice fine brush here. It's actually, I think this is a 0/10. It's a very, very tiny brush. And I switched to a 0/5 because I actually find this one to be a little too finicky for some of these. It's a nice long brush, which is good, but I struggle with control with the really long brushes. So I switched to a shorter brush down the road here, a blue brush, you'll notice it. And that's a slightly bigger brush. It has a wider head to it, but it's a shorter brush. So I have a little bit more control. Just adding a little bit of shadow around that eye now. And then the eye is kind of a bulb that comes off of the face. So there's a little bit of a shadow within that eye as well, with a little exterior highlight that I've left as white. And that's going to get darker and darker as we go. Just establishing that first layer of shadow now. You can see the little shadow in the orange again, just to make it feel like it's coming forward a little bit, adding just a tad more now. Just want to make sure it feels like it's three-dimensional. Now adding that into the back. So this is the bulb of the eye you see coming off there. A little shadow around the top of the eye as well. That little crease that we just added. Picking up a bit of paint there. I put a little too much down. You can always pick up paint with a clean brush. I do that quite a bit. Here, even more shadow. You can see that the page is still wet, so it's really taking off into the water there. And now it's time to add in the pupil. So the pupil is Payne's Gray, and I'm actually using a number 7 brush here. I should probably be using a smaller brush, but this one's working pretty good. It's got a nice tip on it, so it's a nice versatile brush. And there we go. There's that one I was talking about. I think that's the number 05. Just has a little bit more control to it. So I end up using this brush for most of my detail moving forward, even though it's a slightly larger brush than the other one was. So just getting those little shadows in there. I find all of these little details so important. I'm a little detail oriented, so you'll see that I get into stuff like that quite a bit with my paintings. Softening that edge, softening that shadow. And now we're adding in the mouth. That was a bit aggressive, so I just cleaned off my brush there and then went in with a clean wet brush, but I just pulled the existing paint. And now I'm going to soften the edge with a clean wet brush. So to soften an edge, you just take a brush, put it in water. You don't want to go in with a wet brush, but you just want to give it a little tap dry, and then you can pull the paint with a clean wet brush, and you can create a nice transition from your paint into the white of the page or whatever you're transitioning into. I did a little bit too much of a transition, so I'm just adding a little bit more into there. I think that's a bit too much there. Pull it out. There we go. Back and forth, right? That's how I do it. I'm a fussy painter. But you can see how I'm cleaning up everything here with that little brush. So now we're getting into the eye. So I'm using Payne's Gray and that small round brush I was talking about, that number 05 round that has a bit of a shorter head, which gives me a little bit more control. And I'm just doing my best to preserve that small little highlight in there, and that'll help it feel three-dimensional. Just perfecting my circle. Circles are a little challenging. I always feel like with the eyes, you want it to be so perfect too. And now I'm adding just a watered down Payne's Gray to give a little bit of that interior shadow that we see with that translucent eye. So now it's time to add in the fin details. So you can do this with your small brush. So here I'm mixing, it's kind of a blue Payne's Gray together, and I'm using that longer brush again, that longer detail brush. And the reason that I'm transitioning over to that brush is because I might want to use the belly, and that has a bigger belly. So the belly of the brush is the part closer to the handle. And then the tip is, of course, the tip. So when you hear people refer to the belly of the brush, it's kind of like they're pressing the whole brush down on the page. There's my son in the background there. Don't worry, his dad's got him. So I'm just adding in those details. And again, I'm kind of a fussy painter when it comes to details. So this is going to be a little bit of a long step, but I think it's all pretty important. I think being fussy with details is part of what can make a nice painting. So you'll notice that I do twist my art around when I'm doing things like this. And that's because I always want to be facing the edge that I want to be sharp. So sometimes I'm going to turn it around because I want the other side of the painting to feel sharp. If I'm facing the edge, I feel like the tip of the brush gives me that crispness, and then the back of the brush is a little bit more organic looking. So I always want the tip to be facing the area where I want it to be nice and crisp. Like right here, I want the crispness to be at the body of the fish, and then I can use the belly of the brush to kind of pull the shadow over, but I want it to be nice and crisp against the body, so that's why I have the page angled so that my brush is facing the fish. And I do this with acrylic painting. I even do it with drawing sometimes. I just like to face my edges. Always twisting my artwork around. Just adding in that shadow. There's a big cast shadow here onto the fins, so I want to make sure I get that in. And then while that's wet, I can kind of pull out from there and get some nice soft fin details. Now, this step does take me a little while, and it's all kind of the same, so I'm just going to speed it up a little bit here for you so that you're not watching this video forever. Again, just using that tiny detail brush to get some nice fin texture in here, a little bit of a shadow. Now I'm adding in, there's a little ridge at the side. Now I'm just adding in a little bit of a deeper shadow there so that ridge stands out. And go in and zoom in here so you can see, just putting in those basic squiggly lines, just kind of squiggling. I'm not actually looking at a reference at this point. I refer back to it, but I'm doing my own thing in terms of how these fins look. Now going into the tail, you can see here, I kind of push my brush down and that gives me a thick line. And then as I pick it up, it gets me a nice thin line. So I'm able to get a lot of variation by putting different pressures on the brush. I've gone a little slower here because I want to show you guys how you can use the belly of the brush to get some texture, and how you can push down on the brush a little bit to get different thicknesses of lines. Getting nice dark fins. Remember, we're going to be eventually using black here, so even though this is a white fin, we do want it to feel very dark. So that's why we're going in with such dark detail now. And I'm not just using the tip of the brush, I'm using the belly a lot here, just to, there we go, there's a nice streak, what's the word? Stroke. Nice stroke with the belly of the brush there. So I'm using the belly of the brush a lot right here just to add in some nice organic feeling textures to those shadows. Kind of giving myself a nice edge to the fin. I actually love the edge of this fin. And we are going to lose it when we add the black, which is a shame. But if you were to paint this without the black background, I mean, you could totally just do your fin like that and call it a day. It's a beautiful, beautiful brush stroke for something like that. Again, I'm just speeding it up because I don't want to spend too much time on this. I mean, I feel like we've looked at a lot of it now already. So using the belly of the brush there to get some texture in that top fin, and then I'm just going to go in and do a little bit more of a refined shadow. Remember, this is all cast shadow there. All right, now we're going to do the little fish. So I'm just going to speed this up because you've already seen all the steps on the larger fish. Adding in a little bit of that blue shadow to the eye. adding in a little bit of additional shadow to the fins. And after we do this layer here where we add in some richer shadow, we'll add in a little bit more detail after as well, just like we did with the top one. So just kind of getting that shadow started here. I slowed this back down so you can see the belly of the brush working so nicely to create some texture in that back fin. Again, we're not looking at a reference at this point. We just know where our shadows and highlights need to be. So adding a little bit of a shadow around the back end as well. So you can see how the top of the fin really feels like it's coming forward because of that deep shadow underneath the highlight there. Adding a little bit of texture in there. Now it's time to go in for the Payne's gray part of this eye. It's a very small area. You can see how big it is compared to even my fingernail there. So trying really hard to just get that detail in there, try to preserve a small highlight. This other one, the eye isn't quite as prominent, so I'm not going to worry about the highlight there. Now it's time to do the background. So the background is wet on wet, and you can see I'm using that really large ink wash brush again. And again, it just holds so much water, so I don't have to refill it too many times, which is nice. And I think I actually get a little too much water on here, so it starts to do some pooling, which is not ideal. So you don't want any pools of water, you just want a nice amount of water on your page. And now I've loaded this brush up with my Payne's gray and my blue, and you can see how deep and saturated that color is. And I'm trying to just kind of dab it in. I'm going to drag it around a little bit, but I do want it to feel a little bit like watery, so I don't want it to feel too flat. I'm just going in around the tail. I'm using the tip of the brush there to try to create an organic feel around the tail. I'll just be adding this color pretty much to the entire thing. So I'll speed up here pretty soon, but I do love how the paint can just take to the water. You can see it really moving over here now. All right, so I'm just going to speed up. Again, I'm just going around the fish, dabbing in color. Dabbing in this deep Payne's gray and blue, trying to get a nice kind of water feel. You can really see it taking off now that I've sped up a little bit. Actually, it all looks way cooler when I've sped up. There's a lot more water kind of pooling on the right hand side of the page. You can definitely see it moving on the right hand side, and that is going to give me some problems. You can see it gathering in certain places and lifting in other places. So what is it going to end up happening is I'll probably do another layer here, and that's okay. I'm just going in now real close with a smaller brush. You can see how the paint's pulling into the water. I just want to make sure that I'm getting into those smaller details. The wash brush is great, but it is hard for those really, really small details. So that's why we want to get in here with a smaller brush while it's still wet. And then while the painting is wet, we also want to pull just a little bit of texture into some of these fins, because the fins, we want them to feel kind of translucent, right? So here I'm softening that beautiful edge that I had in there. And I go a little bit too far with this. So what I actually have to do is lift a little bit out. So I'm taking a clean brush and I'm just twisting and pressing, and I'm not scrubbing it. I'm just kind of pulling some paint out here with a clean brush, and you can see how I just kind of lift it out. And this is another really effective way. It works out really nicely in the end, just to pull out the paint here. But you don't need to just pull with a paper towel. You can definitely pull with a clean brush. So every time I'm pulling my brush away, I'm just grabbing a paper towel and I'm squeezing the paint out, and it's giving me a cleanish, dry brush to pull that paint out with. So that's pretty much the end of the steps of the painting. Now, as I said, my shadows, I thought they were dark enough when it was on a white background, but then once I threw in the Payne's gray blue background, the shadows did not feel dark enough. So I just spend the next little while here basically redoing steps that we've already done, but I'm doing them a little bit more aggressively. So I'm adding in some richer shadows here, but there's nothing new. So I'm just gonna kind of go real quick through this here for you so the video's not too long. But just deepening some of those shadows so that it feels like it's blending in with the background a little bit more. This bottom fish here, like those, see how the back fins just feel like they're fading into the background? That's really what you're looking for there. And then I can just deepen this red a little tiny bit to create a little bit more of a shadow. We're gonna add one more layer of black. Now I just sped through this. Twisting always so that I'm facing my edge. All right, so that's the painting. If you do this painting and you want feedback, just tag me in it and I will actually respond to you and give you feedback. I love being tagged in artwork. If you like this video, subscribe, give me a thumbs up, all that fun stuff. And again, follow me on Instagram. It's creations_by_Kendra or Facebook at Creations by Kendra. All right, guys, happy painting. Thanks.